Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel and podcast. Today I'm going to continue talking about unstated symbolism in an apparently historical work like the Gospels, a work that I believe is an instance of memoir reportage, where the author is not being deeply self-conscious, the author's merely telling what happened. And we talked last time about the low probability that a person would put an unstated symbolic meaning into such an instance of reportage. So if I tell you that I saw a car accident with a red car and a green car, I'm probably not, and you're probably not, if you tell the story, trying to put some heavy symbolic meaning into the colors red and green. Today I want to continue on that general topic by talking about the problem that it is too easy to come up with abstract, conjectural, symbolic meanings once you go down that road. Now, why is being too easy a problem? That's what we're going to start learning today. I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about here is justification and epistemology in knowing that someone put an unstated metaphoric or symbolic meaning into what appears to be a report. It's always possible, in terms of the ontology out of the real world and what's in someone's mind, that the author thought of something symbolic that influenced him to put it into the document, but you could know that only if you were a mind reader. Okay, so of course, we're not talking about strict logical possibility. We're talking about what is probable. What's the way to bet? Or an author could give an interview later on and say, hey, when I mentioned that number 153 fish, I had this symbolic meaning in mind, if the author of the fourth gospel gave an interview. But we don't have any interview indicating that. We don't have mind reading capabilities. And if that is the only way that you would be justified in believing that an unstated symbolic meaning was there, then in fact you're not justified in believing it because you don't have that. Okay, I want to introduce what I'm going to call the Gilbert and Sullivan problem. I'm probably going to try to find a public domain image of Gilbert, who wrote the lyrics to the songs written by Gilbert and Sullivan and the operettas that they wrote. And there's a famous line in one of their songs: if everybody's somebody, then no one's anybody. Okay? And that applies, and that helps us to get at the notion of it's being too easy to come up with an unstated symbolic motive. Think for a minute of a lottery, okay? Now somebody's going to win that lottery. All right, let's call it a closed lottery. It's guaranteed that somebody's going to win. If you're using a method that enables you to come up with an argument for thinking that every single person who could have won it by cheating, then you don't have a good argument that it was won by cheating. If you're just using your imagination to come up with something that you could just as easily do for anybody who won the lottery, then your ability to imagine that is not a good argument for cheating when someone wins. And we'll see this illustrated as we go forward in the examples that I'm going to be giving and the things I'm going to discuss this time and the next time. I'm going to plan to have 3 videos. If everyone's somebody, then no one's anybody. If every possible outcome could have a symbolic meaning attached to it, or in the lottery a claim of cheating attached to it, but something has to be, something's going to be written down. If it's a story, you're going to put something in the story. If it's a lottery, someone's going to win. Then you're not doing it right. You're not having sufficiently high standards for concluding cheating or concluding symbolic meaning. All right, so today I'm going to illustrate this issue by talking about the fact that we could find multiple equally bad, equally unconvincing, equally far-fetched, alleged symbolic meanings for the same detail in the text. And next time I'll be talking about the fact, which is related, that we could find equally bad, equally far-fetched motives if the details of the text had been different details. So we'll see how that works. The two examples of claimed symbolism, unstated symbolism, that I'm going to be using for these first two videos in this mini-series here. Of course, you could count the previous one as part of the same mini-series. One numerical and one non-numerical. The numerical one is the claim in John 21 that they caught 153 fish, which has been the subject of much numerological speculation. The non-numerical one is the claim that John dyschronologically moved the temple cleansing from the end of Jesus' ministry to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and that he did so for some symbolic reason. The fact that a lot of scholars think he did it for some symbolic reason doesn't really hold any weight once we see how arbitrary it is to pick a symbolic reason that he could have had. All right, if you're creative enough to think of one meaning that something might have, the one that perhaps is actually being suggested, the one that's actually on the table, then you could take that same degree of creativity and apply it and come up with a host of other alternatives. And this is what I mean by being too easy, that once you engage your speculative and creative abilities to the extent to come up with this one, then what about this one and this one and this one, and how do you choose between them? All right. That shows that these details are poorly suited as a vehicle for symbolic meaning. But supposedly, this striking coincidence between the alleged motive, the alleged symbolism, and the actual details was supposed to be the reason why we think that this is symbolism. All right, and that's where people will say to you, why are you saying that's just coincidence? Well, yes, the same way that I would say that all these other possible numerological meanings are just coincidence. Once you recognize that we're talking about a disjunction, it's either this or it's this or it's this or it's this, and nothing to choose between them, then there's nothing striking anymore about the coincidence. If everybody's somebody, then no one's anybody. So let's see how this works with the 153 fish. All right, I found this one online. It wasn't associated with a church father. I think it might have been just the blogger's own idea. Supposedly, there were 153 portions of the Torah that were read in the synagogues over a 3-year cycle. And then the suggestion is that the author of the fourth gospel is alluding to this with 153 fish and saying that everything in Judaism that is good in God's relationship with his people is carried over to Jesus and Christianity and Jesus' relationship with his people. All right, well, now once we get that speculative, what about this one? This suggestion was made by St. Augustine. 153 is, I believe it's called the triangular number of 17. So, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, etc. And you can form a triangle out of these up to 17, and you get 153. Well, what's so special about 17? Well, then Augustine delved a little deeper into the realms of speculation, and said it's the sum of the 10 Commandments and the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit. Okay, so that's how we get 17. Now, Augustine didn't believe that the gospel authors made stuff up, so he doubtless believed that this really happened. So as we talked about last time, just saying, well, why couldn't it be both, and raising that as a possibility, a logical possibility, doesn't remove the problem with these unjustified, hidden symbolic theories. The fact that Augustine thought that they really caught 153 fish doesn't mean that he's justified in this elaborate combination of 17 and then the triangular number of 17 and getting 17 from the 10 Commandments and the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit. All right, St. Jerome knew of an ancient bestiary which listed 153 species of fish, supposedly all the species of fish that there are in the world, and then suggested that this 153 fish represents the fact that all the nations of the world will come to know the gospel. Again, extremely far-fetched. Which of these is actually good enough to rise significantly above the others? They're all far-fetched. And if everybody's somebody, then no one's anybody. If you think that the 153 species of fish, or 153 as the as a triangular number of 17, is significant somehow, then why don't you think that the 153 Torah portions are significant? And we could probably go on if we were creative enough and find even more possibilities. It's not going to be all of these possibilities, and the arbitrariness draws attention to the fact that this number of fish is a poor vehicle for conveying symbolism. In fact, a number that supposedly is the number of something that really happened is generally a poor vehicle for conveying unstated symbolism. Now, obviously, John could have put it in there. He could have said, and just as, just as there are a total of 153 species of fish in the world, so also there were 153 fish in this catch, representing that all the nations shall come to God. I mean, if you put that in there, then we're like, okay, a little weird, but that was apparently what you had in mind. But unstated symbolism is much harder to be justified and concluded. And the arbitrariness of selecting one of these highly conjectural suggestions emphasizes that. It emphasizes that it's not well suited. Okay, let's do a non-numerical one. That John supposedly dyschronologically moved the temple cleansing to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Again, if you haven't seen a video of mine before, just started watching, dyschronological narration is when an author knows that something didn't happen at that time or in that order or didn't take that length of time, but deliberately makes it look like it did for the purposes of his story. It's not the author just narrating in such a way that he doesn't really intend to convey any particular chronology. So the idea here is that John did very deliberately, indeed, if it's going to have a symbolic meaning, it has to be deliberate. He knew that Jesus cleansed the temple supposedly at the end of his ministry and not at the beginning, and he deliberately made it look like Jesus cleansed the temple at the beginning in order to suggest some theological, symbolic meaning. If you're wondering, I think Jesus cleansed the temple twice. I don't think this is far-fetched. I don't think the two narrations are so remarkably similar that it would be, strained to think that something broadly similar happened twice. Okay, but that's the view. All right. So I'm gonna give three possible theological purposes here for John allegedly moving the temple cleansing. Some of you may know which of these has been seriously suggested and which have not, but some of you may not. So what I'm going to challenge, pretend you don't know, if you do know. 2 out of the 3 I literally thought of when I was trying to fall asleep one night. Okay, so I'm getting fuzzy, and I'm like, let's get creative. What are some reasons why, if we thought John moved the temple cleansing, why he might have done that? What sort of, symbolic, theological meaning he might have wanted to convey? And one is serious. One, I actually have a text by a scholar that says he thinks this is a plausible conjecture. So I'm in no particular order. All right, I'm going to give these. Jesus cleanses the temple at the beginning of John, at the beginning of his ministry in John, rather than at the end, because John wanted Jesus' temple cleansing to occur at the same time that John the Baptist was still alive and ministering, to symbolize that Jesus was a more effective purifier of the nation than John the Baptist. All right, another one. John moved the temple cleansing dyschronologically to the beginning to emphasize that Jesus' whole ministry was, symbolically speaking, one long Passion Week, because his readers and hearers allegedly knew that it really occurred at the end of Jesus' ministry during Passion Week. So if John narrates it at the beginning, this symbolically makes his entire ministry into one long passion. And third option, there's a dialogue between Jesus and the religious leaders in John, where they ask him for his authority to do this. And so John moved it dyschronologically, a suggestion to emphasize that the religious leaders were without excuse in rejecting Jesus because they had seen this sign of the cleansing of the temple early in Jesus' ministry and had been warned of Jesus' authority, and that Jesus was claiming the authority to do this. And yet they did not believe, even though they had all of this time from the beginning of the ministry. All right, so which is which? Ding, ding, ding. The one about making it one long Passion Week that is seriously suggested by Craig Keener. The other two I came up with myself while I was falling asleep. This is what we mean by saying that it's too easy. And of course, the variety of ideas, the variety of possibilities for the 153 fish, all of those have been seriously suggested. Again, emphasizes the idea that once you engage your mind like that, it's too easy. How would the audience get the idea that Jesus' whole ministry was one long Passion Week? Maybe if they read of the cleansing at the end in the synoptics, or heard of it in the synoptics, and at the beginning in John, maybe they thought he cleansed the temple twice. Why not? Or maybe they wouldn't have been able to dream this up. Maybe they would have just thought John made a mistake. Maybe they would have just been baffled. How would they have dreamed up that particular meaning and said, oh wow, deep, man, profound. Jesus' ministry is one long passion, as opposed to any of the other possible meanings they could have dreamed up, even if they thought that John moved it for a symbolic reason. Picking a symbolic reason becomes arbitrary. So I'm going to spin out this lottery analogy. Let's suppose that Jennifer wins the lottery and that Bill chose the lottery winner, supposedly by a random process. You suggest that Bill cheated on behalf of Jennifer. Why? Well, you did some research and you came upon the fact that Jennifer is Bill's third cousin twice removed. But that is so speculative that if we're going to focus on Jennifer and say Bill cheated for Jennifer, why pick that motive, that she's his third cousin twice removed? Suppose Jennifer, let's say Jennifer has blonde hair and Bill's girlfriend also has blonde hair. Maybe Bill likes blondes. Maybe that's why he picked Jennifer. Turns out Jennifer and Bill both have some Irish ancestry. Maybe Bill is really into his Irish ancestry, and that's why he picked Jennifer, and so forth. The arbitrariness of finding any particular reason for thinking that Bill was interested in Jennifer and wanted her to win and chose her on purpose by cheating shows that Jennifer's selection is poor evidence for cheating. The mere fact that Jennifer won. So what do these have in common? Well, one or more of the following. We're lacking independent evidence that the suggested symbolism or motive would have even been accessible to the author. We don't know that the author of the four Gospels had ever thought of the concept of a triangular number. Why think that? Okay, why think that until I heard this speculation concerning the 153 fish, I had given no thought to the concept of a triangular number. All right? So how do you know he even had access to the fact that 153 is a triangular number of 17? Or what about the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit? Well, that's supposedly based on an Old Testament verse, but we don't know that it was part of the early church's connection with, like, confirmation. The rite of confirmation is sometimes said to bestow the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit that early in the early church when the author of the fourth gospel was alive. So we're lacking independent evidence that the suggested symbolism or motive would have been accessible to the author. With the lottery, we don't have any reason to think that Bill even knows that Jennifer is his third cousin twice removed. Do you know who your third cousins twice removed are? Probably not. Okay. Second possibility, so it's one or more of these. We're lacking any independent evidence that the author would have had the suggested motive. This is a little bit different. Was it important to John to suggest that Jesus' whole ministry was one long Passion Week? Did his mind even work that way? To say, this period of time, which really was 3+ years, is really representative of this period of time, which is less than 7 days. Was that important to him? Even if John had known the concept of the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit, would it have been important to him to try to symbolize something using them? Even if Bill knew that Jennifer was his third cousin twice removed, would he care? would he want to say, I want to make sure she's my third cousin twice removed. I want to make sure that she wins the lottery. And then thirdly, even if the other two aren't a problem, the details of the text, as we've already discussed, are poorly suited for communicating that idea. And we can see how poorly suited they are by spinning out multiple possibilities of meanings for that detail, showing that the readers would not be justified in concluding that. So if John thought that it was going to be somehow spiritually helpful to his audience to think of Jesus' whole ministry as one long Passion Week, he did a really poor job conveying that so that they could get that spiritual benefit. Now, I want to close here by contrasting this with the case I used in the previous video concerning Chaim Potok's novel, The Chosen, which I sort of raved about. It's really an amazing literary tour de force, and you should read it if you haven't read it, if you read fiction at all. And if you don't, what are you even doing with your life? You should certainly read fiction. Fiction is great. All right. But I gave the example from there that Danny's father, the Rebbe, is this ultra-Orthodox rabbi, and ever since Danny was a little boy, he's been raising Danny in silence. He doesn't talk to him in any ordinary sort of human way. The only time they talk relatively normally is when they're studying Talmud together. And Potok also, in the same novel, talks about the silence of God. The novel's set during World War II in America, in Brooklyn, among the Jewish communities there. And at the close of World War II, they start learning about the extent of the death camps and the Holocaust, and they're just horrified and stunned. And I even read you a passage in which Reuven's father, Reuven is the person who narrates the story, his father asks bitterly whether God answered Danny's father, the Rebbe, when the Rebbe asked how could God allow such a thing. All right, so he's examining the silence of God, and he has this unusual silence between the Rebbe and Danny, but he never explicitly comes out and says that the silence of the father over here symbolizes the silence of the father over here. But you're still very, very well justified in thinking that symbolism is going on. Portraying God as silent in the face of evil is a very plausible and very accessible motive for a Jewish author writing about World War II. And Potok explicitly draws attention to the silence of God. And then the metaphor of a silent father is a very good and accessible and readily recognized metaphor for the silence of God. Everybody in the novel thinks that the silence of Danny's father is weird. I mean, everyone outside maybe his immediate religious community, everybody talks about it. Reuven is shocked. Danny himself tries to figure out what is my father doing with this silence. Reuven's father is disturbed by it, so they comment on it. And then the exception that he talks to him when they study Talmud is equally striking and equally commented upon. And of course, very accessible as a motive that and a symbolic meaning that God speaks to his people, speaks to the Jewish people through the Torah, right? And then the Talmud is commentaries, right? Commentaries on the Torah. And that by studying these commentaries, they're committing themselves to Torah learning and Torah study. And so the idea being that God is silent except when he speaks to us through the written word. Again, not explicitly stated, but very accessible as a metaphor. So all of these are ways that we know the details of the evidence in the novel are well suited to convey that symbolic meaning, even though he doesn't quite come out and say that that is his symbolic meaning. But that's how we can know that that really was his intention. We are not forced to go far afield into wild, speculative, numerical suggestions. All right, next time, I'm going to talk about a complaint that those of us who reject unstated symbolic meanings in the Gospels will sometimes, I think, rightly make. It's a different way of looking at the Gilbert and Sullivan problem, which is that we'll say, well, if you're going to do that, you could do that for anything. All right? So, hint, what if the number of fish in John 21 were something different, something other than 153? So you can maybe predict a little bit about where I'm going to go with that the next time around here at the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel and podcast, where we're making common sense rigorous.